So welcome everyone to the April 14th Affordable Housing Education Series. Tonight's theme is sustainability, density, planning, and zoning. We have panelists from the City of Ann Arbor, the Ann Arbor Housing Commission, and I don't know if there's an agreed upon order in which y'all wanted to present. There's pictures that are in an order. Brett wants to go first. Great. You can go first.
I think Nathan's about to give me master command center control.
I did that in the beginning, Brett, so check and see if you can share your screen.
Perfect, thank you. Can you see a very 1970 looking slide that says Ann Arbor zoning?
Yes.
All right, terrific. Good evening. Good evening, Housing and Human Services Advisory Board. Thank you very much for having me. Ms. Hall and Dr. Stoltz, thanks for having me. And thanks for doing this series. I've had the good fortune to watch a few of them and they're outstanding. So really brought some great expertise into to talk about these matters. The title of my slide presentation is a little bit of a lie. I am going to talk about some zoning, but I'm going to talk about some other land use related items. But just to start to nerd out a little bit, zoning is used to regulate private property. It is used to tell property owners what they can build, how they have to build it, and what they can use it for. And it evolved nationally and at the city in a very similar way. The earliest pre-zoning ordinances were based on perceived nuisance uses, and sometimes they were used quite insidiously, and I think sometimes they were used with more good intent. They were often banning nuisance uses. In San Francisco, they were really intended to ban a population of Chinese immigrants who had flocked to the city as part of the gold rush. Over time, some of those nuisance ordinances started giving way to what I would say are more public health-based ordinances. The New York tenement house law was one of the precursors to zoning, and that really brought a very specific focus of things like ventilation and plumbing and fire safety to residents to ordinance requirements. That evolved in several states, a few in the Midwest, all over the country, Los Angeles. There started being a bit of a focus on specifically segregating nuisance uses from residential areas. That happened across the country. And then in 1916, the first comprehensive zoning code is adopted in New York City. And it is sort of the first ordinance that puts together uses, area height and placement requirements, brings a public health aspect to it, in that it's not only about what's happening in the buildings, but what's happening to the public realm, what's happening on the sidewalks, segregates uses by zoning district. And then in 1922, the federal government gets in on it and publishes the Standard State Zoning Enabling Act, which is distributed to states as sort of a way for them to start legislating the ability for and directing zoning in all of the states. Like I said, Ann Arbor follows a very similar pattern. But before we start, remember that Ann Arbor, the entire history of the city is on land that was occupied by indigenous people before the settlement of the city and before the entire arc of history that I'm going to talk about. I think that's really important to remember. After settlement of the city followed a very similar course, banning slaughter of animals in the city, morality protections, getting rid of gambling houses, getting rid of houses of prostitution, because of the negative impact it would have on the youth of the city and all of the young men who are coming to the University of Michigan from all over to study. Saloons, decidedly okay. Those were booming through this time period, expanding rapidly. The University of Michigan enrollment triples from 1900 to 1919, and with it comes a physical construction boom, a lot of new buildings, a lot of expansion. In 1922, the Olmsted brothers, Frederick Law Olmsted Jr. and John C. Olmsted, recommend zoning to the city of Ann Arbor. they were doing a lot of planning work throughout Southeast Michigan. I actually think a lot of it was funded by the Detroit Edison Company at the time. And they recommended the west side shall be for factories and the homes of working men. And the east of Washington and south of Gettys is the place for suburban and country homes, as they called it, the beautiful neighborhoods of the city. In 1922, the Stabler filling station is constructed, which causes an uproar as the first new commercial development encroaching into a residential neighborhood. And the first apartment house is built as well, and spurs the development of the city's first zoning ordinance in 1920. In 1923, 4 zoning districts are established in the city, 2 residential districts, a business district, and a commercial and industrial district. As you can see, not all areas of the city are zoned, but the majority is. Similar to New York, it designated zones, said what uses are permitted in those zones, and designated area height and placement, setbacks and height restrictions that could occur in those zoning districts. It was 4 zoning districts, and it was 7 pages long. Today, our zoning ordinance is 34 zoning districts, 10 overlay and character districts, and 319 pages. I did the pithy math on that, and that is like 3 new pages of regulation every year, and about a new zoning district about every 3 years over the course of zoning in the city of Ann Arbor. So what's happening as this zoning evolves? We're adding a lot of requirements first to the way development has to happen. Over time, we add paving requirements. You have to pave your parking areas, you got to pave your driveways, you got to pave sidewalks on your site. We add landscaping requirements. You have to provide street trees. You have to provide trees in parking lots. You have to, at times, plant landscape screening buffers between different land uses. We institute stormwater regulations to ensure that stormwater runoff is controlled to the extent it can be, and it improves water quality. We add parking, bike parking. We add processes and reviews. We expect cost contributions and fees for tapping into our utility systems. And we require natural features mitigation. Sometimes we make decisions that reduce the availability of land for development to happen at all. We use historic preservation, and I have a little star there because obviously historic preservation recognizes that development has taken place there at the beginning. However, we at times, while doesn't prevent future development, we restrict premiums, for example, in historic districts. So we do restrict in some ways what can happen there. We add requirements of open space, lot size, and density requirements, and we require buffers around wetlands and limit what can happen in floodplains. And I want to stop and be clear, all of these are very valid public policy goals that have been furthered through a lot of appropriate development and a lot of appropriate regulation. Collectively, though, over time, they add cost to development and they limit the opportunity for development in some circumstances. This results in high costs, limited supply of housing potentially, and that results in scarcity and higher costs, which limits the opportunity for often lower income households to be able to access and come and live in our community. Some communities, Richard Rothstein, I'm sure most of you have read this. For those that haven't, highly recommend it. Some communities were really intentional and racist in enacting zoning to segregate their communities. Baltimore banned Black families from moving onto white blocks and vice versa. Atlanta had a white residential district and a Black residential district. Indianapolis and New Orleans, Black families could only move into predominantly white areas if they had the written consent of the majority of white residents that were residing there. And then the lengths at which some communities went Richmond, Virginia, they banned interracial marriage and then banned anyone from living in a place where they couldn't marry the majority of residents on that block. And 4 years before the 1922 plan recommended to the Ann Arbor City Council, Frederick Law Olmsted Jr., in speaking to the National Planning Conference, in any housing developments which are to succeed, racial divisions have to be taken into account. So this was definitely ubiquitous in a way throughout the development of zoning in our country and our city. Now, Ann Arbor, I've added a question mark to exclusionary zoning in Ann Arbor. I've not yet found that very pointed, I will say insidious race motivated zoning action in the city. I'm not saying it's not there, I'm still learning, but I don't see it. But in 1957, our ordinance uses language like servants. In 1950, I think that does have a tone as it relates to race. And then in 1963, the city created 2 new zoning districts. One is the R2A 2-family or duplex district, and one is the R4C or multiple family zoning district. Over time, both these districts were modified to require larger and larger lot size and more space per dwelling on those properties. Now, I don't see this as pointed as some of those other national examples that were highlighted in the Rothstein book. However, they do limit housing supply, they do limit access, and they do constrain the amount of housing that can be constructed in these zoning districts in our city. So I'm going to, this is where I'm going to deviate from zoning a little bit. And I just want to acknowledge, more for my sake than the audience, that, as I go through these experiences as a white male, I recognize my privilege. I don't profess to understand all of the impacts that members of our community have experienced through these occurrences. But in 1960, what you see here is the dark blue on the map is the area of the city that has the highest percentage of Black residents from census data. This is the Carytown area, just north of downtown. In 1959, like a lot of other cities across the country, the city was considering an urban renewal plan. The urban renewal plan was focused in federal funds to support the elimination and removal of slum and blight. And the city's plan was similar. The city's plan was described the situation in the area that 17 homes are so substandard they cannot be brought up to meet code. 20 more homes are in very poor condition that would require significant cost to bring up to code. And 7 homes are in commercial areas. Even the good houses have a common problem: mixed land use. Commercial buildings are located in the middle of residential neighborhoods. This means families might have to live above storefronts on busy streets. The fix: the city's going to buy 23 commercial properties and 44 homes at fair market price. Then the city will resell the property through a competitive bid process. For displaced residents, particularly low income, the city will provide relocation assistance for up to 5 years if necessary. And one advocate is that it would be a calamity for Ann Arbor to miss this great opportunity to improve our city. 1959, City Council terminated the urban renewal plan. So feels like a bit not zoning policy, but perhaps a near miss of some very intentional land use policy that would adversely impact, in this case, particularly Black residents of the city of Ann Arbor. After urban renewal, the model cities is the new program of the federal government. And this brings not only removal of blight, but it also brings services and support to these same neighborhoods. Has some success. It has funds for new preschool facilities, new medical and dental care in low-income neighborhoods, but maintains the aspect of updated land use plans and improving traffic patterns. towards the goal of a more effective transportation system. One of the most controversial and long debated aspects of this is something called the Packard Beaks bypass, which would have changed a significant transportation through this neighborhood, requiring a lot of acquisition of property in order to accomplish that. And as you can see, a lot of community debate about, again, not unique to Ann Arbor, but Ann Arbor was in the thick of that conversation about how capital transportation investments would specifically have some adverse impacts on predominantly Black neighborhoods in the city. Several properties, despite that at the end, the city went to a vote of the people to bond $935,000 to complete the construction of it. The electorate voted it down pretty significantly, like 20,000 against to 8,000 for, which ended the bypass project. Nonetheless, during that time, the city did purchase some properties in this neighborhood for the construction of that bypass. So while from a zoning perspective, we didn't really, I have not yet found those very pointed aspects through time and a lot of other factors. There's definitely been a redistribution, particularly of Black residents throughout the city of Ann Arbor. From 1960, again, I showed you that map, to 1980 to 2019, you see those population densities being dispersed throughout the city. Noteworthy in 2019, a lot of those census tracts happen to be the census tracts where a lot of cooperative housing was built in the 1960s and 70s in the city of Ann Arbor. Colonial Square, Forest Hills University, and Pontiac Heights, now Arrowwood cooperative housing. So, so we, as a city, I don't think we, by any stretch, get a free pass. There was a lot of policy discussions that would have had a really adverse impact on people of color in our community. There were some good parts of that, and where at times our community stepped up and made good policy decisions. At least that's how I look back on them, as good for you. Nonetheless, as you see from the distribution of residents, it's not all been success. And generally, over time, Black residents in the city increased as a percentage of the population up until about 1980. From 1980 to today, that has been slightly decreasing on a census basis every 10 years. So when we come back to zoning, over time, again, for good reason, for good policy reason, for appropriate, well-established public city goals, we have made development more expensive, and we have at times made where development can happen less plentiful. And that doesn't mean we need to scrap all of those goals. There are a lot of ways that we can approach improving that framework going forward. One is we can spread those costs over more homes or space. Density also has an impact about what land is available for development. How can we get the most to advance things like housing supply out of it? And whenever possible, since transportation is such a significant household cost, whenever we can be creative and thoughtful about providing more housing opportunities with transportation choices in our community, that helps provide more opportunities and access to our community for a greater range of income and households. And with a quick thanks to Mr. Abdul Ateo, who helped me with some of this research, and the awesome community collections at Ann Arbor District Library Resource and the Hathi Trust, I will shut up and turn it over to Missy.
Brett, thank you so much. And thanks to Mr. Leonard and to Ms. Hall. And thanks to all of you for allowing me to be here. And I'm sorry I'm not on camera. We are in transit at the moment. I think Zach is going to run slides just in case. I will say hi very quick. Hello, glorious human beings. It's really good to see you all. And with that, I'm going to preserve some bandwidth. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the intersection of sustainability, affordability, and housing, picking up where Brett left. And here's the punchline. I'm going to get to density, which is one of the most controversial topics I think that we experience from a sustainability standpoint, and I think broadly from the community as a whole. So to ground this, Zach, if you don't mind going to the next slide. I think most of you, all of you, know the city of Ann Arbor has a goal. Zach, can I steal the next slide from you? Yes. A goal called 820, and the vision behind that is that together the entire community achieves a just transition to carbon neutrality by 2030. It's ambitious, it's aggressive, and it's absolutely essential. And as we work towards that goal, it's really important to understand where our emissions come from. And I'm going to talk about this building on what Brett just said about transportation and buildings. So I'm going to tee that up while you're looking at this. Here's what we know. When we look at the emissions profile in Ann Arbor, the majority of our emissions come from our buildings. Right? And you can see that because it's building electricity at 40%, natural gas to heat and cool our homes at 27%. That's roughly 2/3 of our community's greenhouse gas emissions and climate pollution. A third is coming from transportation. And what that tells us, can you guys still hear me?
Yeah. Yes.
Great. Okay. Great. What that tells us is that the intersection of our built environment and how we move about that built environment is really, really powerful and important. If you go to the next slide, Zach, I'm just going to briefly talk about the built environment, right? I just mentioned 2/3 of our community-wide emissions come from how we experience buildings. And this isn't the embedded carbon. We're not capturing that yet in our inventory, although we're working towards it. And by that, I mean the embedded or the embodied carbon in the steel, in the wood, in all of the materials that go into that infrastructure. This is literally how we operate and experience that built environment that we're in. And when you add in embodied carbon, it can be quite even more significant, the impact of our built environment. If you go to the next slide, because of that, we are working on a lot of initiatives to help advance the sustainability of our built infrastructure. We are doing a lot of work on energy efficiency because the best energy is the energy you never have to use, right? And energy efficiency allows us to have comfortable, safe, healthy homes that also happen to be more affordable to live in and to operate. We're working on initiatives around renewable energy because that's critically important to make sure that we power our lives with clean energy, energy that powers us and allows us to function in all different ways and also protects and preserves the beautiful environment and natural systems upon which we all depend. We support beneficial electrification. Of course, we're monitoring air quality because you should live in a safe and healthy place, indoors and outdoors. And the pandemic taught us that more than ever as we spent so much more time than normal indoors that literally most of us live in places that are unsafe. We found out there's a
Missy, you got muted.
It's necessary. Sometimes you have to mute me. I know.
I didn't mute you.
I'm just teasing. I get it. Well, I'm going to go to air quality just really quick and say more and more research is showing the impact of combustion from things like a natural gas cooktop or stove and what that means for indoor air quality. Most of our homes aren't properly ventilated. That means we're literally breathing in toxic fumes, and our most vulnerable populations are experiencing that. And during the pandemic, we had heightened exposure, and we will continue to have negative health ramifications from that. So we're working on all of these things with the goal of figuring out how do we get safe, clean, affordable, healthy, and sustainable buildings, right? So great, good on us. Tap ourselves on the back, proceed. When we think about the transportation system, we know that roughly 1/3 of our emissions come from fuel used in the vehicles in terms of how we move about our community. We knew pre-pandemic, roughly 85,000 commuters were coming into the city every day. And we know that how we move about a community really, really matters, right? How we move in it, through it, around it, all of that is critically important. If you go to the next slide, Zach. So that's why we think a lot about the different ways that you can move within a community, right? We want people to have options. You should be able to walk and to bike and to take transit or scoot or telework or electric drive. Get in that electric vehicle should you have access to one, or you drive in your car. But walking and biking, those are great things. But if you can't walk and bike to the things that you need, it doesn't matter. If it is still 5 miles to go get a gallon of milk or diapers, you are still going to drive 5 miles, right? If you have a vehicle, or you're going to wait an extremely long period of time for transit to be on the same time scale that you're on. We have to make sure that people can get to where they want to go if we are ultimately going to reduce emissions from transportation. It is not enough to have a lot of buses. People have to have buses that take them where they want to go on a schedule that's convenient for their lifestyle. You have to be able to walk to places and get what you need. So we know inherently that how we move about that community matters, and we need to have choice. And here we work actually quite a lot with our colleagues in transportation. We have Vision Zero, which we deviously were able to like co-opt. So the goal of Vision Zero is zero traffic fatalities, and we got them to also agree to zero greenhouse gas emissions. I'm very proud of that one. So Vision Zero is both of those zeros, right? If you go to the next slide, Zach. So as we think about kind of all of this intersectionality, Brett set us up for this. Really sustainable places, what we are aspiring for is really desirable, right? I want to live in this community where I can walk and bike, where I have safe, comfortable, affordable homes that let in natural light all the time because there's great natural systems. That's where people want to be. We also know that unsustainable practices are inherently baked into so much of how we function. They're often subsidized. It is almost always easier to do the thing that is unsustainable. And so we have to break systems and pushing past that. And sometimes, a lot of times, that's uncomfortable. And so we have to think about that intersectionality. But the beauty is there is, in fact, an opportunity in here to be sustainable and to be affordable. But to do that necessitates that we be very purposeful and intentional about making sure we have housing for everybody. We have to have, of course, affordable housing. And Jen's going to talk about some of the extraordinary work that she's doing in a second. We have to have market rate housing. We have to have middle income housing. We cannot have the extremes, right? We miss out. We can. No, let me just be clear. Sure, we can do that. That is a fine path. Should we decide that's what we want? I will tell you it is not what I want. But if we want to go that path, we can go that path and have extremely high end and extremely low end housing. But if we want to make sure that everyone is welcome and has a chance to live in our community, then we have to face some challenging topics, which I know you all know. So it's like preaching to the choir. But if we go to the next slide, I want to just kind of bring this home by talking about what often is the elephant in many rooms that I get to sit in, which is density. And this is a graphic that shows greenhouse gas emissions based on kind of in the inverse of population, and it makes sense, right? As you have more people, you have higher greenhouse gas emissions. But if you look at the blue line, what we also know is emissions per capita drop when you have more density, right? So a person living in Ann Arbor, I can tell you this because we know this, has a lower greenhouse gas emissions footprint than someone living in a rural area of the of the county or in a township. We just have more options, right? You can walk, you can bike. Transportation emissions do tend to be lower within the city itself because we have greater density to get to the places you want to go. And so how do we actually tackle this? There's zoning, which Brett talked about. How do we make space for a lot of different users and maybe a lot of different uses even within the zoning? Do we need to bifurcate kind of our users and our uses? Maybe, maybe not. If we really do want to hit our goal of lower greenhouse gas emissions, one philosophy is you stop letting people live in Ann Arbor and you just reduce all the emissions. Well, another philosophy could be that because we have lower greenhouse gas emissions, because we're capable of having higher density, greater walkability, more sustainable codes and practices around how we build, that it actually makes sense to encourage people to be here. Because on a global perspective, it is better to live here than somewhere else. But I will say we hear both of those things. So how do we actually tackle this? And I might be stealing Ms. Hall's thunder and saying sometimes we think about density as like there's a magic amount of density, or there's a magic amount of height in a particular building, right? If it goes too high, you're using too much concrete and too much steel, and therefore it cannot be sustainable. Well, maybe, but if you push those exact same people out to the suburbs and you have to run all of that water infrastructure and all of those sidewalks and all of those additional roads, isn't that also unsustainable? And so sometimes we're not thinking about this as an or. We didn't have the counter narrative. We just say we don't want, as opposed to where will they go if they don't go here. And so that's part of the discourse that we're starting to have, is really compare and contrast the options and think about people want to be here. They want to be in our place. They want to be in Washtenaw County. Where are we going to encourage them to go if we're really serious about affordability, sustainability, quality of life? I don't know the answer, but it's a question that we think about a lot. You go to the next slide, Zach. So just some examples of things that we are putting forward. We have, we allow accessory dwelling units. Brett will tell you how many we have, should you want to know. It is not a lot, right? Because it's really, really difficult to build. But that is generally a good practice in terms of letting more and different types of uses exist within the city. Mixed use zoning. I have alluded to this a few times, and this is something I really care about, is I want to be able to get the accoutrements that I'm looking for in a much more accessible way than having to necessarily go downtown for everything or having to go out to Briarwood Mall. There's a draw to this idea of kind of a complete community. If you go to the next slide. Thank you. One of the things that when we were putting together A20, that we thought a lot about, and if you're at all familiar with A20, you know that we think about transportation, we think about built environments, we think about the circular economy. There are actions across that entire spectrum. Well, one of the actions that we put forward after we went through our public engagement was the ability by right to be able to build duplexes, triplexes, and quads in any part of the city. And we heard this because people wanted to live here and people couldn't buy houses here because they kept getting priced out, but they wanted to be here. And so how do we tackle that? And so we put this forward and it went to city council. And if you click again, so this was the action. And they said, absolutely not. And they removed it. And I will tell you that this one action, we had 45 actions in A20. This one action was the reason the plan almost didn't pass. And I don't think most people know that the plan almost did not pass, but it took us months of negotiating to figure out where we were stuck, and it was this. The idea of by right being able to increase density it just broke and divided lots of stakeholders in the community, and it still does today. And so the negotiation was we had to remove this from the plan. And I bring that up not to say good, bad, mistake, excellent choice, but more this is the reality of this work. That as we're thinking about sustainability, as we're thinking about affordability, as we're trying to find the intersectionality of all of these different efforts, when we're centering equity and justice in this work, we have a lot of opportunity for growth. We have a lot of really challenging conversations that need to happen. And the thing is, they already are. We may not be at the table having them, but our neighbors are. And people are talking about this topic. And we are sort of at this really important, I think, inflection point to figure out what we want to be going forward. What we are today is okay. And what we were is also okay. But what we can be could be great. And we have to decide what greatness looks like for us. So Zach, if you just want to click through. Just to kind of end this, and then I'll turn it over to Ms. Hall. There is so much tension in the landscape as we try to work on equity, sustainability, affordability, but there's also incredible collaboration opportunities. I personally am really, really blessed to be able to work with our other speakers to name these kinds of tension points and try to find solutions around them. There is no silver bullet. No one has done this. No one has figured out how to do this across all of the different elements we're talking about today, but that's also a space of innovation if we choose to take it to demonstrate the kind of leadership that I think all of us hold within us and want to see released. We're going to have to struggle through trade-offs. It's going to be uncomfortable, but this is the opportunity, and this is what leaders rise. These are the kinds of occasions that leaders rise to, and I think that we've got the kind of leadership to really challenge what's possible in terms of creating a sustainable, affordable, and welcoming community for everybody. And I think with that, I'm going to kick it over to you, Ms. Hall.
Great, thank you. I do a lot of collaboration with both Brett and Missy, which is super exciting because it often felt like I was banging my head against the wall for 30 years. And there's a lot more people who care about this work now and are interested in changing the way our community looks, including our current city council, which is super exciting. I'm going to take all of this policy discussions that Brett and Missy just discussed and sort of show what happens in a real life example in an actual affordable housing project. When I first started here about 12 years ago, our properties, our public housing properties, 18 of them were in terrible condition. Without going into too much detail, other than to say underfunded by the federal government, there was a initiative by HUD that allowed us to redevelop all of our sites starting in 2014. And what we did is went with our developer and general contractor to every one of our sites and said, okay, which sites are worth preserving? Which sites were built in good condition, had features like accessibility, et cetera, that we need, and which ones are in such poor condition that we really just need to demolish the buildings and start over, and which sites had the opportunity to increase density. And so that those issues all fed into our project, I should say. It's two different locations that we call Swift Lane, which we have now learned never name something Swift, because this took the absolute longest out of every project that we had to go from concept to actual development. Oops, sorry. I just want to show two of my favorite pictures. I have a third one, which is a bunch of toilets we tore out and lined up on a sidewalk. These are two of the sites that we ended up doing demolishing. The one on the left was 4 single-family homes, which I love that somebody spray painted that we needed public housing now, just as we were about to demolish these houses and rebuild them. And then on the right, as we were vacating this building and relocating people out, we had a tenant who turned off their furnace when they left and didn't realize that you really do need your furnace on in the wintertime. Otherwise, your pipes freeze, the pipes burst, and you end up with a mess like this. It was like our second to last tenant who left. So we had the first site I'm going to talk about is, we used to call it White State and Henry. We've renamed it State Crossing. And it is across the street. It's on State Street, close to the Stadium Bridge, right across from the new U of M football practice stadium over there. And it's a sort of a U-shaped building. The old building was a U-shaped building. And it looks really beautiful, like an old red brick building, but on the inside, the condition of the building, it had many issues with asbestos, lead-based paint. You can see these steps going up to the building. Every single apartment had steps going up and steps going down. So we had 0 accessible apartments. And at that point, we had 28 apartments. So that's the State Street site. Our second site is on Platt Road. It's currently called Creekside Court. And it was originally these houses right here were these just really hideous looking 5-bedroom houses. There was 4 of them, and 3 of them were actually in the floodway. And one of the first times I went to visit a tenant who had a complaint, they said there was water in their basement. So I went over there and they showed me, and there was literally a fountain of water coming out of the floor, like a drinking fountain spigot going about 3 feet up in the air. From being after a heavy rain, it was just seeping right out of the floor. This is a site that we owned, that we also had this vacant parcel right here in the middle. And when we were looking at redeveloping these sites, we knew we had to demo these buildings and move them out of the floodway. And we knew there was an opportunity with this vacant area to have a much higher density here. And we ended up acquiring this duplex from a private owner so that we could have an even larger expanded site when we did our redevelopment. So in both of these sites, we had the opportunity to both increase our density as well as our accessibility. You can see that these houses, there's nothing accessible about them. You have to go up the stairs to go in them. So it's State Street Crossing. This is our new building, very different feel to it. You can see it's essentially the same shape. It's sort of a U shape. It's the same footprint, but instead of a 2-story building, it's now a 3-story building. What that allowed us to do is increase from 28 to 32 apartments. And we were also able to add a community center and property management office on site, which we did not have previously. And all of our apartments that are on the first floor, which are 10 of them, are completely barrier-free. So we went from no barrier-free, no accessible apartments to having 10, and then we added some apartments. And then at Creekside Court, over here was the 4 single-family homes, and over here was the duplex. And now you can see we have 4 buildings. We went from 4 public housing unit properties, excuse me, to 32 apartments. And we rebuilt and included all of those 5-bedroom apartments, which is very rare in the community. It's very hard for low-income families who have large families to find, 4 and 5-bedroom homes. So at this site, we have 1 bedrooms all the way up to 5 bedrooms. And that way, as people's family sizes shrink or grow, if there's an opportunity to move into another apartment in the same location, then we have those options. Every apartment size has at least 1 barrier-free apartment. And then every apartment that has a first floor entry is a completely visitable apartment, which means there's a no-step entry. The doors are wide enough that if somebody has mobility issues, if they're in a wheelchair, they can get in. Has a first floor bathroom that is accessible, and that there's a accessible path into the living area. Whereas the barrier-free apartments are actually, lowered countertops and specifically designed for somebody who might be in a wheelchair. We also added this community center, which we didn't have a community center on site previously. One thing I want to note when you look at the roofs, I don't know if you can, how well you can see this, but this is the south side of the roof that has no obtrusions through the roof. And on the north side is all the vents and things that you have on any apartment or building that you build. You have natural venting that you have to have. And so we purposefully designed this site so that there could be solar panels added to all of the south side and maximize the surface area. And you can actually see that on this roof too. We made sure the vents were placed in such a way that you could maximize the solar panels that you could add onto the roofs. And those are things you have to think about and design when you're at the early stages of your project. You need to be on the same page with your architect, your engineer, your general contractor, and what your design goals are. The other thing to think about when we were doing our buildings were really all the sustainability features that we wanted to add. And one thing that's to keep in mind when you're doing affordable housing, we have restricted revenue. Like all of our rents are restricted. So if our costs increase, we are not able to just increase our rents to cover our costs, just like the private sector. And so the biggest thing that we have little to no control over is utility costs. And so anything that we do to make the buildings more energy efficient up front is saving on utilities. All of our apartments, the rent includes utilities. And so it's not something that is the burden on the tenants, it's actually the burden on the management of the properties. So in addition to wanting to meet carbon neutrality goals and meet sustainability goals, actually the real world impact is both operating cost savings, it's accessible features, it's healthier living environments, it's community spaces. Like there's so many other features that are a benefit when you have the ability to frankly build from scratch. So these are just some of the items that we included in these projects. As when you're applying for funding for affordable housing, you braid together lots of different funding sources. The one that's most prevalent is low-income housing tax credits, and you do get extra points for meeting some green goals. So on this particular project, we did what was called a National Green Building Standard. On other ones, we've done the Enterprise Green Standard. And so this is literally the scoring we had. We had the same score for both sites, even though they're very different looking type buildings. And so we didn't, hit the uber green at the emerald level. We were sort of in the middle where we reached the silver level, and then we had a little bit higher scores on different items. So what is that? What are the things you have to think about when you are doing your design? Because you may have these very high and lofty goals on the sustainability side, but how does that impact your development costs? Every type of funder now that we apply for funding from asks you to have some kind of green or sustainability type features, and you get points for that. But you also lose points if your development costs are too high. And so you might have some of them, you lose points if your total development costs or exceed a certain level, or your square foot cost exceed a certain level. And so this is just an example of what the tax credit application that we won in this particular funding round. We were able to secure tax credits. We actually had to apply 5 times, took 2.5 years before we were funded, primarily because you can see the very first category on here is place-based criteria. And this goes back to a lot of what Brett and Missy were talking about in the walkable features, the services, the access to what's happening in your community. You get a lot of points for being in a walkable neighborhood. So these 2 sites, one on State was much more walkable than the one on Platte. And so we didn't get a lot of points there. And then the second arrow, we got extra points for having those barrier-free and invisible units. And we always target a much lower income than what's required by the type of funding that we have. So we got a lot of points there. And then if you look at the other categories, we're at the bottom. When you look at your quote cost reasonableness, we lost 5 points on the cost reasonableness. In the application before this, we had actually lost 11 points. And so they had changed their scoring criteria to such that we had the same project, but then they didn't factor that as highly as they had previously, probably because they received feedback that, asking for and expecting, these nicer, you don't want these cheap, leaky buildings that don't have visibility features and things like that, don't have community space. But when you add those features, you're also adding cost. And so they lowered the penalty, so to speak, for adding those kinds of features. And anytime you're applying for funding, you're always looking at these scoring criteria, sadly, and trying to figure out, where can I get points? How can I get funded? I missed a screen. Oh, no, I didn't. That was it. I'm sorry. But I'm going to go back to this screen because oh, I lost my screen share. I'll say it verbally. So when we looked at our total cost, just on the construction side, not the soft cost, not the permitting or the architect and engineer, just the actual physical construction was about 15 million for these 2 properties together, total of 64 units. It's going to vary. Every property is going to differ depending on the type of construction, how dense can you build it, what features you're trying to incorporate. But it was approximately a 4% increase in cost to include all the accessible and sustainable features that we included. We did not have enough funding to actually install solar panels. That would have been another $500,000. So it would have been more of a 7% increase in cost if we were able to incorporate that feature. And that, don't take that as a golden rule of how much it costs to add green features. Like, it really changes from project to project. And I will stop there and let folks ask questions.
We have a couple of questions from the audience, a few questions from the audience that I'll go through first. And then if board members want to ask your questions, and if there are more questions from the audience that come in, we can bring those in. So the first was, I think it was at the end of Brett, your presentation. And the question was about the status of Ann Arbor City's research and community engagement around the racist and racialized history of single family zoning. So what's the status of that? Has it commenced? Is it in process? Could you speak to that?
Sure. A couple things. You're seeing some of it. It's happening at a staff level. Originally, I and the Planning Commission were talking about a more widespread community education series on it. Part of the reason that we are not moving forward with that currently is the good work that this group is doing on an education series. We thought that the opportunity to actually bring some of these conclusions to this broader conversation made sense. And I think the Planning Commission hasn't made a definitive decision. My recommendation to them, I'll just be forthright, is that we actually shift that focus to an update of an upcoming comprehensive plan, and just talk about how we want to think about these residential districts going forward in the city.
Thank you. The other question, let's see. And this is a question from Missy, so I hope you've got phone bandwidth to answer live. The question was, given that A20 is a living plan, is there an opportunity for council to reconsider adding by right density to it, which is the part that Missy had described as having been removed?
Yep, absolutely. So through either public engagement, we could get an interest in that particular topic. It could come through revisions of the master plan, which Brett is leading. It could come from a council initiated kind of edit and change, but that is certainly something that could come back into A20 as well as lots of other great ideas.
Is that something that would be, it could be a council action? It doesn't need to be like a voted or like a public vote, like a ballot measure?
Nope, it wouldn't have to be a ballot measure. What we're trying to do is not open A20 every time, but open it once a year. And so we're internally at staff kind of working through what recommendations we would bring forward to council for their consideration, gathering their recommendations, and then every year opening it up. So that way it's not, while it is a living plan, we want to use most of our energy in actually reducing emissions as opposed to changing the plan itself. So we want to try to get more on a schedule of making those edits. So no, it doesn't have to be a vote of the people. It just has to come forward and council has to readopt it.
Great. And then another question, and this is for, I believe, Jennifer Hall, would increased zoning density have allowed for a higher sustainability rating on the project that you shared? And would that have translated into being more competitive for funding or being awarded more funding?
Potentially. So the other thing about we're going to talk about this at the next two HHSAB presentations is about the financing. The type of financing that we use has a total development cost limit that limits the number of units that you do in a single project. So a lot of developers do phased projects, and you can't do a phased project with height. You can only do it with separate buildings. So there's a point at which I think we could have gotten taller at our State Street site. At some point it does become a community norm or a community expectation, because all of these issues that Missy talked about that are part of the public discourse happen in all of our meetings that we go through as we try to get through site plan approval. We get all kinds of comments about, the impact on traffic, the impact on electricity, the shading, how much wind is going to be created, like all of those different issues. So, but to get to your question, I think in some sites you could have added density, and that would have been more efficient use of funds for your development, but it's not going to be the main factor, and you can only go so high in one site, which you'll see in our discussion that we had about 350 South 5th that City Council recently adopted a PUD and supplemental regs where we had 2 towers, and we purposely had to keep one tower that was all affordable at a shorter height than the tower that potentially might have mixed income.
Great, thank you. Did any other guests have a question that they want to ask? I, of course, have a list, but I can let somebody else go first if there's another question. Anna.
Jennifer, I had a quick question, and I think you've probably talked about this in the past, but do you have an estimate of how much you will save because of, there was extra cost to do the sustainability features, but do you have an estimate of how much savings you'll have over the, next 25 years or whatever because of those investments?
Yeah, I knew someone was going to ask me this. I meant to look up because we did have, projected studies done on what our savings would be. And the one thing I do remember is when we did Miller Manor, which was not a tear down, but a rehab, and we added, insulation and, more energy efficient appliances and things like that. And we also did add some solar panels. We ended up with a about a 12% annual savings. And this is, it's hard when you have affordable housing discussions about adding things that will save you energy over time. So like my personal house, we put solar hot water panels on, we put solar electric on our house, and we had the cash to pay for it up front, and we have savings over time. Most affordable housing projects, you don't have the cash up front. Like we need grant money to install those features and then see the savings on our operating side, so that we literally don't have operate in the red. A lot of models, they're like, hey, put these panels up and you'll break even, and it'll take you 7 years or 10 years to, get out of breaking even. Like that's not a model that works as well for affordable housing.
I have a question that, so in HHSAB, one thing that comes up quite frequently is defining affordable housing. And it sort of ends up being sort of a drain around which we swirl, seeking clarity with various people having different perspectives and different interests in that conversation, skewing or shaping how they're approaching the conversation. And density sounds to me like it might be a similar goal/word. And I was wondering, even for me, the contrast that was made was Ann Arbor density, lower carbon, rural communities, less dense, higher carbon, but there's a lot of variation in the density in Ann Arbor. And I was wondering if there's any work illustrating or sort of creating clarity around what density means in Ann Arbor, and what I can understand what duplexes might look like in a neighborhood, but is there like a density map or a real clear definition of what a density goal would be? I don't know who might want to answer that, but maybe Missy or Brett or Jennifer.
Well, I'll start. No, there isn't a specific goal. So I think that from a zoning perspective, which that's why I'm here, when we constrain density to, let me say, any level, we are potentially driving that framework. Unless you believe unless you look at it that if the housing doesn't get built here, it won't get built anywhere, which I don't think any of us presume. So whenever we constrain one unit from being built on a lot in the city, we are increasing the chances that that unit is going to be built somewhere else that might not benefit from the infrastructure and choices that Missy is talking about from a sustainability perspective. So that's one aspect. Planning Commission recently had a similar conversation. Maybe is what you're getting at is, how do we measure that? How do you compare, what something is being proposed versus an alternative? And I haven't given up on it, but it's really hard. It's really hard to do because there are so many variables. It's pretty difficult to say that this is going to be a carbon footprint of X and this is going to be a carbon footprint of Y without pretty deep dive analysis on those specific aspects. And my sense is we've got a lot of room without getting to that level of detail to just playing the odds. As we provide more transportation choice and more density in walkable areas closer to jobs, we're going to provide a lot more sustainable benefits. So I'll stop there. I don't know if Missy, do you want to add anything to that?
I think that was really, really good and important, Brett, what you just said. The only thing I can add is that density is not a ubiquitous term that means the same thing in different places. We have to have this conversation about what density is appropriate and where. And it may not be the same in every part of the city, and that's okay. But part of that we just need to have that conversation as a collective and define what we mean by it. So I think your question is a really, really good one. And we're not talking density of downtown Detroit or New York City or Chicago, yay DePaul, but we are talking density of Ann Arbor and what's appropriate for us here. That doesn't answer your question, but
it does. I think the follow-up I was going to make to that was I have heard in conversations that I have with people talking about affordable housing, but also talking about density. Some people want a house with a yard, for example, and seem to believe that that is entirely impossible when density is a goal. And I was wondering if on the topic of density and affordability and sustainability, Jennifer, if you could talk about, you've already talked about a bunch of projects that you have, but the townhouses and places like Carrot Way that have backyards and other housing projects have yards and access to gardens. Could you, I don't know if there's anything you'd want to add about what that might look like in terms of maintaining both density and some green space, if people really wanted that and wanted to champion affordable housing that had green space.
Yeah, I mean, it's a really interesting challenge. Like, I think if you were to be able to build a quote ideal community from scratch and had endless amounts of money, you would build density of buildings, mid to high tower type buildings with lots of public spaces that are with trails and parks that everybody can use, as opposed to, low density housing where everybody has their own private yard. And when you think about the infrastructure that we're all as taxpayers supporting in our community, those of us, myself included, who live in a single family home that happens to back up to a park, which is awesome, we are the most subsidized type of housing in the community when you look at per square foot of sidewalks, water, sewer, roads that are supporting, the driving time of police and fire, like all of those things have a higher cost on single family homes than it does on multifamily homes. And so if you did design, if you have a choice of how you would design stuff, I think like how we did ours with townhomes, if you took all the green space we have and divided it up between the 32 townhomes, the amount of green space, divided up between each family is going to be smaller than if we had single family homes. When they're added all together and aggregated, you can still have kids out there playing soccer, or you can still have a designated space for a garden and things like that.
Thanks.
Yeah, I would just add on to that. It's there, and there, I think it goes to what Missy is saying, that there has to be a conversation, because when you ask 10 people that pose that question to 10 people, you're going to get 15 different answers. but I've been thinking about it in a couple of contexts. One is I think about my own home and my yard, and I think about it from a perspective of sometimes when we're contemplating development, and we sometimes have this conversation, and it's a dialogue between the regulators and a proposer or an applicant. As we add requirements on, sometimes you can add enough requirements that you will make it infeasible. And so sometimes when we try to solve every problem out of every property, we're not going to probably get anything addressed. And I think preference and what Jennifer's talking about, that happens a little bit with our choices about homes, right? Me making a decision to live in a home with a yard, like that there are other ways for me to access outdoors. There are other ways for me to find defensible space. Front porches are ubiquitous in town for good reason. And so I think that is probably a similar community conversation as density. And part of it's sort of reframing. Do do we individually need to accomplish all of these goals that we need for the lifestyle that we want within our property boundaries? I will generally say if the answer is going to be yes, that every one of our homes has to satisfy every aspect, we're probably in a lot of trouble.
I have another question, obviously, but I can, does anybody else have a question before I prattle on? Okay, so one thing that I saw when I was looking, or when Brett, in the historic pictures you were sharing, and then in some of the like proposal drawings in Missy's slides, was the sort of mixed use in residential areas. And I know that recently council has made some progress on the transit corridors, which in part, as I understand it, aim to draw or to develop housing along existing transit corridors. But I've heard, and those pictures reminded me of sort of historic small businesses within communities. So there's an old grocery store on Minor that's now a yoga studio. There's these little, you see them all through our neighborhoods, like buildings that look like they used to be grocery stores or auto body shops, or I don't know what they were, but now they're houses. And my understanding is that unless, like Knight's Market, they maintained that business over time, they no longer get that legacy permission and it reverts to whatever the general zoning is. One, correct me if that's wrong, but two, is there any possibility of moving not only housing to where we have these large sort of business transit corridors, but also bringing small businesses like mom and pop grocery stores. I don't know if anybody wants to open a mom and pop grocery store these days, but should they want to in one of those buildings, is there any changes that could happen to zoning to re-allow those kinds of uses in communities?
Yes. Short answer is yes. So as Ann Arbor was no different, Ann Arbor followed a lot of patterns of the similar pattern to a lot of communities where segregation of uses was considered ideal. And like Ann Arbor, many communities are starting to push back against that. Here in Ann Arbor, done pretty well. If you look across most of our districts, for example, most all of our zoning districts, apart from our residential districts, allow a multitude of uses, including residential. So when you are driving along Washtenaw and you're driving along Stadium and you're driving along Plymouth, many of those zoning districts allow for residential. We don't always get it. And so that is an intention of the new transit corridor district, is recognizing and contemplating what land use levers can the city do to help further that really important interplay between land use and transportation system. But then as it relates to those other uses, yes, zoning could be reconsidered. That is part of the A20 plan. I again think that that is part of a conversation as to what does that mean. The notion of the mom and pop grocery store, as much as I would love that.
Liquor store, maybe.
But that is the question. You know, what is the vibe? You know, retail follows some patterns of rooftops and demand, and the notion of small grocery stores in every neighborhood are probably not a viable retail model in this day and age. But yes, we can have the conversations to say these commercial uses are permitted in residential zones.
And I just wanted to jump in and share that mixed use zoning is in A20. Like that made it, and it continues to be something that we advocate for. And I think about things like Argus and an ice cream shop. And, you know, like there are things that very much could pop in a lot of residential districts that would fit within that character. And that there was a lot of community support when we talked about A20 for those kinds of uses being easy to access throughout the community.
Are there any other questions from our attendees or people with little rectangles with their names? Okay, seeing no more questions, I'm going to end the affordable housing educational series on planning, zoning, sustainability. Was affordability in there? And thank Jennifer Hall, Brett Leonard, and Missy Stoltz, and their shadow crew, Zach Smith, and Nevo, are you helping out? Maybe you are, for the presentation. And I think we can end the recording there.